manager here at Banner Alzheimer's Institute, and I'll also be your moderator this morning. In 2018, we have been in a pursuit of answers in our Dementia Dialogue series, where we tackle pertinent questions for caregivers of people with dementia. And so in November, with Thanksgiving upon us, we thought this was an apt time to talk about the importance of self-care. And I know oftentimes this is really challenging for caregivers, and so we're going to be examining the question, how am I supposed to fit in self-care when I don't have a minute to spare? You know, it often seems like we have so many things on our agenda as a caregiver, and then we add in self-care on top of it, and it just is one more thing on our to-do list. And so we're going to examine this subject a little bit more closely today. Our expert today is Maura Keyhays, and she is a licensed clinical social worker specializing in counseling and case management of adults across the age continuum. Keyhays is well-versed in programs and services that can enhance the quality of life for patients and families affected by Alzheimer's and other dementias. She also co-facilitates support groups for care partners at Banner Alzheimer's Institute. Welcome, Maura.
Thank you so much, Heather.
Thanks for being here today and helping us examine, I think, a really important topic for caregivers.
Yes, very relevant for caregivers.
So let's just dive right in and kind of start at the beginning. And I want to ask, why is self-care so important for the caregiver?
Well, Heather, simply put, if we're not physically and mentally healthy, we cannot sustain giving care to others for very long. We've all had an experience in life when we've gone to work with a cold or had to care for our child at home when we were sick and we didn't perform at our best because of it. For most caregivers, their role is ongoing for months or years at a time. So physical and mental health will worsen if it's not attended to regularly. Most caregivers do have some awareness that caregiving has a direct negative impact on their physical and emotional health. They feel more fatigued, sleep poorly, they'll postpone their own medical care, they're going to feel more irritable, sad, depressed, or even anxious. Research does confirm that poor caregiver self-care has a significant impact on the caregiver's health and their ability to care for their loved one. And poor caregiver health sometimes contributes to their person being placed in a facility earlier than otherwise. What I want to do is share a few statistics that illustrate why self-care needs to be a priority. More than 40% of family caregivers report that emotional stress of their role is high or very high. Caregivers who provide care for persons with dementia caregivers who provide care for persons with dementia risk compromising their immune system for up to 3 years after their caregiving experience ends, thus increasing their chances of developing a chronic illness themselves. That was quite a shocking statistic to read. The physical and emotional impact of dementia caregiving resulted in an estimated $9.7 billion in healthcare costs in 2014. Another shocking fact. Estimates show that between 40 to 70% of caregivers have clinically significant symptoms of depression, with approximately 1/4 to 1/2 of those caregivers meeting the diagnostic criteria for a major depression. Nearly 3/4 of caregivers reported that they had not gone to their doctor as often as they should, and more than half had missed doctor's appointments. And one final statistic I wanted to share was that caregivers' self-care suffers because they lack the time and energy to prepare even proper meals for themselves or to even exercise. And about 6 in 10 caregivers in the national survey reported that their eating and exercise habits are worse than before they began their caregiving experience.
Wow, Maura, I was familiar with a lot of these statistics, but the compromising your immune system for up to 3 years after their experience ends is really staggering.
Right. It really illustrates the fact that stress has such a profound effect, not just in moment-to-moment experiences, but it'll have a lasting effect on your physical physical health.
Mm-hmm.
So I shared some of these statistics to really illustrate just how critical of the need for self-care really is.
Mm-hmm. And even hearing these statistics, and as I would suspect some of our listeners are familiar with some of them as well, but this really begs the question, if we know these statistics, we know self-care is so important, why is there still a barrier to it?
There's many different factors, and I'll share just a couple that caregivers often share with me as one of the many reasons why self-care gets put on the back burner. Caregivers are laser focused on attending to all of the care needs of their loved ones. They might also be working, have children at home, or other obligations that pull them in a number of directions at the same time, not to mention any unforeseen emergencies that might come up and derail them from moment to moment. They're taking on more, if not all, of the day-to-day responsibilities for the household in addition to caregiving. So they're paying bills, they're doing housework, meal preparation, scheduling of appointments, etc. And when one has a high level of stress, it gets more difficult to sort through all of the competing priorities of the day and incorporate time for oneself. Self-care usually gets put at the bottom of the list of things to do, and is as the case with most of us, and we could probably agree between us as well, that we don't often get to everything on our list every day. So if self-care is at the bottom, then it's going to tend to stay at the bottom. Yeah. Some caregivers don't have ready access to respite from family or an outside agency. So that's another barrier. And lastly, and also importantly, many caregivers perceive self-care as indulgent or a luxury or not a required task. So those are some of the barriers that I've heard from many of caregivers that I work with.
Which is interesting because when we were discussing our first question, you brought up like caring for a child or something like that. I feel like the perception is different. Like as a mother, it's important for me to take time away and time for myself, and I feel like that's more accepted than as a caregiver of someone else. It's not as widely accepted or encouraged to do that or recognized as a priority even.
Right, yeah. It's unclear why there's that disparity between the role of a mother and child versus the role of a spouse and their loved one. Yeah, very interesting.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that because in other roles that we've likely had in our life, we have made self-care that priority, but for some reason now in this role, it's at the bottom of the barrel.
Exactly, yes.
So moving on, we really focused on time as being a huge barrier for caregivers. We're laser focused on our person and making sure our person is well cared for and all of their needs are being met. So what can a caregiver do when they don't have time to get away?
That's the million-dollar question,
yes.
Isn't it? Yeah. I think that if caregivers begin to think about small, regular habits of self-care that one can do throughout a day, that is a good place to start. So small and simple. One can practice some of the things that I'm going to talk about in more detail in a few moments, but mindful self-compassion is one that I'll talk about further. It's easy to do in very short spurts of time and is a perfect response to frustrations that inevitably come up in a caregiving activity. Practicing gratitude, which is another thing that I'll be talking about a little bit. Practicing gratitude every day is another way that one can balance the scale of difficult times with the good times that are going on, that we often don't give ourselves time to actually see and acknowledge and savor. And also mindfulness in everyday life is another gift that a caregiver can give themselves that provides many health benefits. And all of these things can be done, again, as I said, in very short intervals that you can connect with activities that you're already doing in your everyday life. So you don't need to find that special time. It can be incorporated into those moment-to-moment experiences.
And so I'm excited to learn more about these because I think a lot of times, too, when we talk about self-care, we're talking about these bigger things. Go out and get a manicure. Go away for the weekend.
Yes.
And it's things that require time and money.
Exactly.
And so I think it's important that we can learn that self-care can be done in these small bursts, and it doesn't require these big expenditures.
Yes, exactly.
To make it happen.
Yeah.
So, teach us a little more, Maura. How can self-compassion, gratitude, and mindfulness help?
Well, it's important to know that for all of these practices, they have all been very widely studied. Many research studies have been done, and they have all shown positive effects on one's physical and emotional health. So they're not just feel-good activities. They really will have, with regular practice, a positive effect on one's physical and their emotional health. So wanted to set the stage with that first. Let me talk first about mindful self-compassion, and maybe take a step back for a second and talk about compassion in general. We've all given compassion to someone else during our lifetime. When someone we know is suffering, we tend to acknowledge the pain that they're feeling, tell them that they're not alone, and offer encouraging words. And for many, giving compassion to others is second nature. However, one typically doesn't give compassion to themselves. Kind of sounds like an odd concept for some people, I would imagine. For some people, our first response when we fail, or if we have a hard time with caregiving, is to be harsh or disparaging toward ourselves. This practice of mindful self-compassion is designed to be used during these difficult moments. And mindful self-compassion does include many different practices, but the one that I'm going to talk about a little bit right now is called the self-compassion break. It has three different components to it: mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness, where we give ourselves acknowledgement for the pain we're feeling, tell ourselves we're not alone, and offer encouraging words, just like what we give to other people, often so freely. So it's important to understand that almost all of us have these skills already in us. So we're not having to learn a whole new concept or a whole new way of being. It's really just turning the reflection that we give to others onto ourselves. So first in this practice, we start with mindfulness because it kind of grounds us in the practice. It allows you to be aware of the present moment experience without self-judgment, without avoidance or repression of our feelings. We focus on our internal experience, whether we have bodily sensations related to our difficult time, emotions or thoughts also are present often. And what we want to do is just be with the painful feelings as they are, again, without judgment or the striving to make them different. Mindfulness statements that people can say to themselves, and this really is a talking to yourself kind of practice. So, and things that we can say to ourselves that are ground us in mindfulness include, I'm having a really hard time right now, acknowledging that. This is stressful, or I'm feeling depressed, sad, or anxious. So it's really naming it for what it is. The second element is common humanity. And what that means is what we're acknowledging is the common humanity of our experience. That means that we are acknowledging or noting that all of us are flawed human beings. We're all fragile and imperfect, and sometimes we fail or we have hard times. And this acknowledgement allows us to counteract that isolation we often feel as a caregiver. Like we're the only one in the world that's having this problem at this time. But when we really take a moment to acknowledge that there are millions of other people in the same shoes that we are in, it helps to lessen or soften that isolation. It is the willingness to extend that understanding to ourselves when we fail or make mistakes. And some of the statements that you can say to yourself as part of this element is, struggle is a part of being human. You are not alone, and there are many other caregivers who are dealing with the same difficulties. Again, kind of grounding us in the community of others who are really experiencing the same kind of stuff that we are. We might not see it or experience it firsthand, but acknowledging that allows us to know that we're not alone. And the third element is self-kindness. This is the act of really pausing to comfort ourselves so that healing can occur. It doesn't focus on problem solving, so we're not in that mode of thinking, how can we get through, past, or away from that experience. So no problem-solving kind of focus at that time. And it is important to use a caring and loving tone when you're expressing self-kindness as you're doing that self-talk. So some examples of self-kindness statements are, I'm so sorry that it's hard for you right now. May I be kind to myself. May I be strong. For many people, it's difficult to find the words that would feel right for you. Mm-hmm. So some of the, what you might want to ask yourself is, what do I really need to hear right now? Or what would I say to someone else in my situation? And then you'll be able to explore words or phrases that really strike a meaning for you, as opposed to other comments or statements that might feel artificial. So it has to really resonate with you. So asking those questions, I think, helps people to come up with their own language that works for them. It's important to note when you're doing mindful self-compassion that many of us tend to avoid or turn away from difficult situations or emotions. With this practice, we're turning toward those difficult feelings and thoughts. So depending on how intense your experience is or the feelings are, it can cause a bit more distress. So you might get activated in some way. So you do need to pay attention to your response and then back off from the practice a bit and do something else that might feel more neutral for you. Because in any mindful self-compassion experience, you might feel a temporary heightening of emotion. So you need to kind of pace yourself, in other words. But self-compassion can be practiced outside of a distressing situation. So that's important to realize as well. You can do this by taking a few moments quietly to bring to mind a difficult event, though not one that's too intense. Then connect with the emotions and the thoughts of the event, kind of let that kind of simmer in your thoughts for a moment. Acknowledge the common humanity of your responses and experience, and then offer yourself self-kindness and comfort. Practicing outside of a distressing situation allows you to hone these set of skills, because again, we don't often give ourselves self-compassion, so it's kind of something that you need to practice or exercise. So
I think all of these skills are really interesting concepts, and they could be really helpful for even people who aren't caregivers.
100% true. Yes. Yeah. These concepts that I'm talking about are applicable to any human being, regardless of what role you play in life or the roles that you play, and those can be helpful to enhancing your physical and emotional health.
So likely it would be a good idea to start practicing gratitude and mindful self-compassion now, for maybe getting the benefit of it later, having a certain comfort level of it later. Absolutely.
Yeah, and you will find that through regular practice, it will have a ripple effect in other areas of your life. So you're right, it's really not just for the caregiver in a caregiving role, but it'll help you in your relationships with other people or in your contact with strangers or at your work. So it has an effect across all different domains of your life.
I recall a couple of years ago, we had the Venerable Barry Curzon come through town, and he talks a lot about compassion and mindfulness.
Yes.
And these just seem to go right into that vein of what he expresses.
Yes. Yeah, he is the physician for the His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
That's right.
And I heard him speak earlier this year. It was exceptionally good. Yeah. Simple but meaningful practices that people can do in their everyday life.
And it seems that you're exactly right. It's simple in everyday practices, but whether we're a caregiver or not, we just seem to be racing all the time, and we don't pause within the moment to appreciate, good or bad, what the experience of that moment is.
We miss life because we're often in the future, worrying about the future or regretting the past. So practicing these different skills allows you to fully experience life as it is now.
And so to recap, we talked about mindfulness, which is really being with your emotions and naming them. And then step 2 was finding the common humanity.
Yes.
Which can help to soften your isolation. And I think this one in particular is so important for caregivers to recognize, because it is, especially if you're caring for someone with dementia, so isolating.
Yes.
And you often feel like you're the only person who's going through this.
Yes, because oftentimes you are just the two of you.
Yes.
Because people don't come to visit anymore, or it's more difficult to get your person outside of the house. So you are logistically, physically alone.
Yes.
But this allows you to not feel emotionally alone, because there's that acknowledgement that I am not the only one experiencing this difficult time.
Right. And then finally, self-kindness, which is offering yourself comfort and not problem-solving the situation. But it seems like, once again, just pausing in this moment and kind of accepting what this moment is.
Yes, so healing can begin to occur.
Yeah. Very good. So I also want to ask, these are great strategies that we can use, but I want to talk about gratitude practice.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, for sure. Gratitude is another practice that people can use moment to moment. And it's important to know that gratitude is not just a feeling, not just feeling grateful, but it really is a deliberate way of thinking or a mindset where we recognize that there's something good in the world. It's also a recognition that we're dependent on others. It's something that one can do when things are going well, or during difficult times, or when life is hard. Gratitude helps us not only see more of the good in life, but we also get more benefit out of it because we can savor those experiences as we reflect on them. It also helps us to get past crises in life. So grateful people are more likely to see a crisis in a positive light and less likely to disengage or blame themselves. And the positive attitude of gratitude helps us to move past stress and prevent us from negative emotions like resentment and regret. And practicing gratitude comes in many different forms, from saying thank you for someone holding a door open for you, or doing a more formal practice of noting 3 things that you're grateful for every day, or even writing a gratitude letter on occasion. And they can be things that you can be grateful for or acknowledge being grateful for is a smile that someone gave you, or a beautiful sky, or a sunset, or also grateful if your person stayed asleep all night and that's been their difficult struggle. Just, again, it's acknowledging the thing that you are grateful for and then having an opportunity to savor that experience. That's how it elevates it. One thing I wanted to share is that I've actually been doing the 3 good things gratitude practice for about 6 months now, every day. I actually prefer to put them, the 3 good things, in writing, because it gives me an opportunity to look back on my entries from previous weeks or months, and I get to savor those experiences, oftentimes experiences that I've forgotten, because it's those little moments of time that at the time you appreciate and you can acknowledge and feel gratitude about. But then you can go back and savor that moment again and reflect back. That really was good. It made me feel happy. I actually use an app called Happy Feed, but people, and it's free, which is nice. But people can use a small journal, or they can get a notebook at the dollar store, or scraps of paper that they can keep. So many different ways of being able to keep track of your gratitude practice. So I just wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, and is there, kind of transitioning into our next topic, which is routine, is there something with the gratitude journal? Do you do it every morning to start your day out right? Do you do it every evening to kind of end your day in a positive light? Is there a right or wrong way to do it?
There is no right or wrong. It really is what works for you and what you can incorporate into your day-to-day experience.
Okay.
And I think one of the things that we'll talk about after I reflect on mindfulness meditation is how to make these different practices part of your routine.
All right.
Okay.
So tell us a little bit more about mindfulness practice.
So the last thing I wanted to mention, again, is about mindfulness meditation. When one practices mindfulness, what they're doing really is cultivating awareness of the present moment without judgment. And they're focusing on, you can focus on your breath, you can focus on movement, a body scan, loving kindness phrases, and many other methods. So mindfulness meditation has been quite popular in on the news and in print and anywhere on the internet. But mindfulness meditation can come in many different forms. So one of the things that I wanted to just reflect on is one type of practice, which is the focus on your breath. What one can do in a quiet moment, you know, that you have, and it could be as little as 60 seconds up to a few moments, or even longer if you're able to squeeze that in, is to focus on your breath where it is most prominent. Typically, for me, it's like as it comes in through my nose, I can feel it, my breath the most. Sometimes for some people, it's where your chest rises, or maybe even lower in your abdomen. And when you're doing your this practice, you're going to get distracted because your brain is always running about different thoughts, things, your list of things to do. And it's important to acknowledge those thoughts or feelings that might come up, and just make a mental note, thought or feeling, and not going deeper or trying to analyze it. Just, I'm having a thought or feeling, and then reconnect with the breath. So getting distracted is not a failure in meditation, because the goal is, again, not to turn our brains off, but to cultivate awareness of the present moment. And that really allows us to respond to life as opposed to simply just reacting.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And I have tried to do mindfulness meditation on occasion, but I haven't found a way to, I haven't made it a priority, I guess I should say, to make it a routine in my daily life. But just those few moments that I take to do that, is you just come out of it so refreshed and rejuvenated.
Yes. And you can do that really anytime. If you wake up in the morning and before you jump out of bed for the day, if you spend 30, 60, 90 seconds, even just attending to your breath and just focusing on that. And when you get distracted by a thought or that list of things that you have to do after you get up out of bed, to acknowledge a thought or a feeling that might come in, reconnect with the breath again. And then for as long as you're able to do that, again, for even brief periods of time, that's how you can cultivate a routine or a habit of something like mindfulness.
So let's explore self-care, making it more routine. Since we've brought this up a couple times now, how would you recommend we start kind of working it into our day-to-day lives?
I think it's first important to embrace the fact that that your health and well-being isn't just important for you, but it's important for the person you care for. So it has to, you have to have some type of external motivation or understanding that it's really, it's a matter of life and limb, essentially, really important for health. And if you're considering any of the practices that I've talked about today, perhaps you can pick one that resonates with you the most. So again, start small. If you're intrigued by something, you're probably going to be more likely to want to learn more and to maybe practice that thing. Then, along with practice alongside an activity that you do every day, as this tends to help with habit formation. So you're connecting an activity that you do all the time with perhaps maybe a self-care practice. So for instance, if you always sit at the kitchen table and drink a cup of coffee in the morning, and you have those few moments to yourself, that's a perfect time to reflect maybe on 3 things that you're grateful for that happened the day before. Or it might be a good time to do 60 seconds of mindfulness meditation with the focus on your breath. Either of these practices can take a very short period of time or longer if you have time to do that. And then again, I've emphasized the importance of starting small. So you might want to do, for instance, the three good things practice Monday and Friday. Start as a goal or an ideal. Or maybe take 5 minutes every Sunday to write a gratitude letter to someone. So once you've gained momentum with that initial goal, then you can build upon it. But it's important to know that just like when we take medicine every day, if we need to, that practices are dose dependent. The more doses of practice that you get, the more benefit you're going to get. So, and then the last word of advice is to take action and give it a try. And whatever you do, have fun with it and approach it with curiosity and interest. So thank you so much for letting me share some of my thoughts today.
Oh, of course. Thank you, Maura.
Sure.
If people want to learn more about any of these techniques that you had referenced, where could they go to learn more?
I'm going to name a couple of different sites that you might be interested in looking at. One is called the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. They have wonderful literature, reading material about this practice, as well as guided meditations. So if you're more inclined to follow a practice as you are being guided by it, that's a good place to go. The Greater Good Science Center, it's part of UC Berkeley. They have an amazing amount of information as well as practices about gratitude and mindfulness. Locally, Hospice of the Valley, they offer mindfulness classes throughout the year, so check on their website periodically. And they have a good dozen or more audio recordings of different mindfulness practices, again, that you can listen to if you're inclined to have something guided as opposed to doing it yourself. 3 books that I would recommend that people explore. One is called Caring for a Loved One with Dementia, a mindfulness-based guide for reducing stress and making the best of your journey together, written by a woman named Marguerite Manteau-Rao. She's a social worker. Second book is The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion, written by Christopher Germer. He is one of the co-founders of the formal practice of mindful self-compassion. And his partner, Kristen Neff, she wrote a book also called Self-Compassion, The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself. So that's a next step in terms of learning a little bit more, either through internet search and or through reading.
Great. Thank you so much, Maura, for your time this morning and for sharing your experiences and knowledge about these different practices that
My pleasure.
I think are really simple for all of us to kind of start to introduce in our everyday lives. I want to invite all of our listeners to join us next month. It's hard to believe, but we're going to be looking back on 2018, looking at a year in review. What have we learned about Alzheimer's and where are we going in the future? Thank you again, Maura, for being here and sharing your knowledge with us. And thank all of you for joining us this morning. Please use your voice after we close the call today. You're going to be emailed an evaluation. Please take a couple minutes to let us know what you thought of today's session and anything else you'd like to learn about. Today's session has been recorded and it will be housed on our website after the close of today's call. Thank you so much for attending Dementia Dialogues, where we bring the dementia education to you.